here's a neural model. As we take a look at these little parts of the neuron, let's get oriented first. Over here on this side would be the body, as well as we come down, this would be the distal portion, or the axon. So let's begin to focus on some of the structures that we can see here on the body. Well, first things first, we can kind of just say that that whole thing is the body, or also known as the soma. Soma means body, or also known as the perikaryon. So the perikaryon, people have defined it as, oh, that's the area around the nucleus, which would be the body. So that's why we call it that. So it could be the perikaryon or the soma. Most people call it the soma. If I were to lift this off, they're just trying to illustrate that, yes, it's three-dimensional, but if I were to cut this off, you can see that it looks very similar to a normal cell. You got the nucleus, you got all these endoplasmic reticulum with the Golgi body kind of here hanging out, and then all these little red dots, those are all the ribosomes, making all our wonderful proteins. So let's kind of get a couple things under our belt before we move on. If we broke out the neuron into four major parts, you can divide them into the things that come off the body, which are called dendrites, the body itself, the soma, or perikaryon, the axon that goes all the way down, and then the part that we actually don't see is when the axon then splits off into its axonal terminals or synaptic terminals or boutons, things like that, whatever you want to call it. But that part is not on this model. We have these three: dendrites, soma, and then the axon. All right, let's take a look at some of the other additional structures that connect this. If a neuron is in space, it is useless. I mean, neurons are made to carry information, and it's just like saying if I have like a video cable or a computer cable and it's just sitting on my desk, it doesn't connect to a computer, it doesn't connect to a TV, it doesn't connect to anything, it's useless. So any kind of neuron has to be connected to something else, whether it's a muscle, whether it's the brain, or something it has to be connected. And here is demonstrated with plenty of other connections. So you can kind of see these other little things that hang off, and touching these dendrites are from other neurons, making connections, passing information. So these are our axonal terminals or synaptic terminals, and then in between would be our synapse. Synapse is just space between the cells. All right, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the anatomy here. So if we already got the dendrites, the soma, the axon, well, what else can we see? We can see the nucleus, the Golgi body, and then this rough endoplasmic reticulum. These are called Nissl bodies. When somebody kind of looked at it, they saw, wow, there's so many kind of ribosomes hanging out from there. Well, that person was Mr. Nissl, and he says, they're my bodies, so I would call them Nissl bodies. I don't know if he had that accent or not, but regardless, that is Nissl bodies, like the stuff that you can kind of see on a microscope. They look like that. They're the ribosomes with the endoplasmic reticulum kind of hanging out from there. So in addition to that, all these dendrites come together in the soma, and then there's only one axon coming out. So this part right here, you can kind of see it cut away, leading into this very, very long axon. This would be considered this triangle portion called the axon hillock, or the beginning of the axon. Beginning of the axon is the axon hillock, most sensitive part of the neuron. Specifically, when we say sensitives, it just has the most channels, so that things can be stimulated there, and voila, you can stimulate the action potential all the way down. From there, you can kind of see the axon coming down, down, with the axonal fibrils coming through there. So, but if you notice, this is not just the axon, there's some cells that surround the axon with its cell membrane. Well, these types of cells, their name is called neurolemocytes. A lot of people call them now Schwann cells because Mr. Schwann actually discovered them, and from there he called them Schwann cells. So Schwann cells is a lot easier to say than neurolemocytes, but regardless, that is what they are, neurolemocytes, and they create what we call a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is all these little, if you can kind of see all these little kind of ridges and all these extra amounts of cell membranes, like so many of them. This is the myelin sheath. And some people can get confused. You know, when I point to this, is it a cell? Is it the myelin sheath? Well, I make this analogy. If you know of a character that wraps his arms around somebody, that just kind of wraps and wraps and wraps and wraps, I could point to this and say, what is this covering? And you would look at it and you'd be like, well, if it's a person, well, that's his arms. And then I say, well, who is that? Well, then you would say, well, that's that person's name. So in the same sense, if I pointed this, what's this covering, all these little layers, you would say that's the myelin sheath. But if I said, what cell is that? You would say, oh, that's a Schwann cell. Mr. Schwann cell, hello. So that is the difference between the myelin sheath, which is actually the layers of the plasma membrane of the myelin sheath. You can't separate them. Just like if I said, oh, So are you talking about his arms or him? They're the same thing. I can't separate them because they're attached and they're part of each other. And that's what we find here. This is a Schwann cell with the myelin sheath on it. And then as it comes over, you can kind of see Schwann cells are kind of short so that they have these little gaps. This is what we call the node Ranvier. It's French, Mr. Ranvier. Kind of found these where there's gaps in between. And you'll also find they're also called neurofibril gaps or neurofibril nodes. So these are the nodes of Ranvier. And then lastly is this connective tissue covering, and this should extend all the way, but they kind of cut it off the rest. This is called the endoneurium. Connective tissue, it sounds a lot like endomysium if you think of muscles, but this is endoneurium, connective tissue sheath to give it some strength and stuff like that for the actual axon. So let's review really quickly. So this is our neuron. We have 4 major parts to it, and the parts of the neuron itself is the dendrites, the soma or perikaryon, and then the axon, and then the axonal terminals, which you can kind of see here from this other side. From there, you can see the perikaryon also has these Nissl bodies as all these, ribosomal endoplasmic reticulum. When it blends into the axon, this is the axon hillock, and then the axon is surrounded by a myelin sheath, which is the cell membrane of a cell called the Schwann cell, and then you have multiple of them, so you have gaps in between called the nodes of Ranvier or neurofibril nodes, and then you have a connective tissue covering called the endoneurium.
All right, Ninja Nerds, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look here at the brain. So if we look here, we have the outer part here, which is the outer gray matter. This is actually the cerebrum, or they call it the telencephalon. And so the cerebrum is this top part of the brain up here, right? And it was derived from the telencephalon during embryonic development. Now, if we look at the cerebrum, it has this thing called an outer gray matter. So it's this outer gray matter, and all gray matter means is it just means it's unmyelinated cell bodies. It's unmyelinated cell bodies. So if we have unmyelinated cell bodies here, that is our cerebral cortex. Now, if you see all these big bumps and stuff that we have popping off of the brain surface, just kind of increasing that surface area, all these big bumps, these things are called gyri, and that means it's plural, right? If I have one of them, that right there would be a gyrus, but I have multiple, it's called a gyri. Then if you see these little like divots in between all of these actual gyri, those are called sulci, and that's the plural form, so that's multiple sulcus. So sulcus would just be one right there. So we have specific sulci and we have specific gyri that we have to take a look at. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those, and I'm going to take this actual part of the telencephalon off so that we can get a better look at it. All right, so if we take a look here, we have our left over here and our right cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so we're just taking a look at it. Now if you look right here, there's this big divot that's separating the 2 cerebral hemispheres from one another. This is called a longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is the structure that separates the 2 cerebral hemispheres. There's actually a dural septa, a chunk of dura matter that actually dips down into this longitudinal fissure. It's called the falx cerebri. It's what helps to protect a lot of the actual cerebral vessels or the dural sinuses that are present within there. Okay, so again, we got left and right cerebral hemisphere. Then we have to take a look at a specific sulcus that helps us out here. So I'm going to turn this around, guys. So if we look here, we have this nice little sulcus running all the way up here. I'll follow it again one more time, all the way up here. That's called our central sulcus. So the central sulcus is important. It's a good landmark because of what it does is it helps us to separate 2 lobes of the brain. So if I come up the central sulcus, anything in front of the central sulcus is my frontal lobe, and anything behind my actual central sulcus is parietal lobe until I hit another sulcus that we'll talk about. But at least we've been able to differentiate 2 different lobes. Frontal lobe is in front of the central sulcus, parietal lobe is after or behind the central sulcus. Now there's another thing. Remember I told you we had these things called gyri, or we had gyrus, which is singular. There's a specific gyrus here right behind the central sulcus. If I take the central sulcus, there's a gyrus right here behind it. A really, really important one. It comes all the way up here. So whoop, whoop, wah. That guy right there is called the post-central gyrus. And the reason why he's important is because there's a cortex there called the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex is the cortex that helps to be able to pick up sensory information from the body via proprioception and touch and cold and hot and so on and so forth. So it's very important. So again, it's called the post-central gyrus. And again, it's also called, functionally, it's called the primary somatosensory cortex. In front of the central sulcus, there's another one, another gyrus right there. So this is this one, R. This one right here is called the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus. But again, functionally, because that's the structural way of saying it, is the precentral gyrus. Functionally, it's called the primary motor cortex. And that has voluntary control of our skeletal muscles. Right in front of that would be our premotor cortex. And if we were to keep going in front of that, we'd even get into the prefrontal cortex up here, okay? So again, what have we covered so far? Frontal lobe, parietal lobe separated by the central sulcus, postcentral gyrus or primary somatosensory cortex, precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex, premotor cortex would be in front, and then we would even have our prefrontal cortex, which is up here. All right. And then what else did we say? We talked about the longitudinal fissure that's separating the two cerebral hemispheres from one another. Okay, now let's go ahead and say that we go ahead and go farther back here to see the separation between the parietal and the occipital lobe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate these 2 points here, and I'm going to turn this guy in here. So if you see here, this is the anterior or frontal lobe. This back here is going to be another lobe that we'll talk about called the occipital lobe. But if you notice, there's another sulcus which is running right there. You see that one right there, guys? That one right there is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. So what does that mean? It's separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So we know that what actually outlines our parietal lobe. If you remember, it was from the central sulcus, which is about over here, all the way over here to the parieto-occipital sulcus. So that's what basically outlines our parietal lobe. So the frontal lobe is from the beginning of the actual brain all the way to the central sulcus. The parietal lobe is from the central sulcus all the way to the parieto-occipital sulcus. And then from the parieto-occipital sulcus back here to another structure we'll talk about in a little bit called the transverse fissure. This is all occipital lobe. So all this is occipital lobe, but I can actually let you see it like this now too. So if I were to actually, again, this is the posterior aspect of the brain. All of this right here, all that I'm kind of like circling around right there, that's all occipital lobe. Okay, guys? All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the actual other lobes that we couldn't see here because we talked about what have we talked about? We talked about the frontal, we talked about the parietal, we talked about the occipital. Now we have to throw in there 2 more lobes, that being the temporal and the insula. So again, guys, so just before we move over to the temporal lobe, which is over here, we're looking right here in the anterior view, so this is the frontal lobe right there. What I'm going to do is, all I'm going to do so that we can get our orientation set up, and I'm going to turn this guy over like that, so we can get a better look at our temporal lobe right here. So again, where's our temporal lobe? Well, let's find out what separates the temporal lobe from all these other lobes over here. So if I follow this guy right here, you can kind of see a little sulcus running right in there, right in there. That guy right there is called the lateral sulcus. And the lateral sulcus is what separates what? It separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe over there, right? So again, this lateral sulcus is really good at being able to separate the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe right there. And again, you can't see the other lobe, but it's actually deep right underneath this temporal lobe. There's a 5th mini lobe called the insula, or they even call it the island of Real. But again, how many lobes have we talked about so far? We've talked about frontal lobe, all the way from the front part of the actual brain all the way to hit the central sulcus. Then we talked about from the central sulcus all the way to the parieto-occipital sulcus was the parietal lobe. And then we said the parieto-occipital sulcus all the way to what we'll talk about here in a second, but the transverse fissure, that's the occipital lobe. And then we said that lateral sulcus right there is what separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then we do have one more lobe, we just can't see it, we'll see it in another model. It's called the insula, or the island of Real. And we will actually take a look at that, and that's the 5th mini lobe. All right, guys, so now what we're going to do is we're looking at the brain here, and its orientation is it's flipped upside down, right? So we were looking at the cerebrum from a top view now we just flipped this sucker upside down. What I want to do is I want to continue to look at some more structures in the cerebrum, just a little bit deeper that we can't visibly see on the outside. So what I'm going to do is we have our 2 temporal lobes right over here. I'm going to take this one off so we can take a better look inside of it. All right, so now we're taking a look here. So I wanted to show you something. I remember I was talking to you guys about the outer gray matter of the cerebral cortex. And again, what does gray matter mean? It just means it's unmyelinated cell bodies. Well, if you see this pink right there, that's the cerebral cortex. So that's the unmyelinated cell bodies, right? All that right there. Even a little bit right there too. all this white stuff that you see underneath it, all this is white matter. And white matter is myelinated axons. So we have myelinated axons right in here. Okay, so all of this is myelinated axons. That's the white matter, okay? Then if we look over here, there's a little cavity in here. And this cavity is called the lateral ventricle. So it's a little fluid-filled cavity consisting of cerebrospinal fluid. If you look right there, this nice little red and blue-like looking structure right there, that's a specific type of structure that you find within the walls of the floor or even the roof of specific types of ventricles, and that's called the choroid plexus. So 43 right there, all of this red and blue-like structure right there, you usually find this in the roof of the lateral ventricle, or you can find it within the roof of the third ventricle, or even the fourth ventricle, and that's called the choroid plexus. It's what makes the cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk about that in physiology when we talk about glial cells. Okay, so if you look right here underneath the choroid plexus, it looks like it's bathing this little structure there, number 41. That's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what's responsible for our memory. So it helps to be able to convert some of our sensory memory and a whole bunch of other different types of memory into short-term or even long-term memory. Okay, so he's very important for memory control. So again, we've talked about the outer gray matter, the cerebral cortex. We talked about the white matter, which is just myelinated axons. Gray matter is unmyelinated cell bodies. We talked about the lateral ventricle, which is a fluid-filled cavity. We talked about the choroid plexus, and then we talked about the hippocampus. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take in the next look. We're going to look at the actual cerebral cortex, the upper layers from the frontal and the parietal and occipital lobe, and some of those structures. All right, guys, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the deeper structures in the cerebrum, but specifically within the frontal and the parietal and occipital lobe. So in order for me to do that, again, we're still in the same orientation where the brain is flipped upside down. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the temporal lobes off. Then after that, I'm going to take the actual brainstem and the diencephalon out. And then we're going to look at some of these other structures in here before we start looking at the diencephalon. So now what I have here, if you can see, remember we talked about the lateral ventricle before? Well, you can still see pieces of the lateral ventricle right here. This is actually a view of the lateral ventricle, this little cavity right there. But there's also another one over here, and that's also the lateral ventricle right there, okay? Then, if you look here, 47, looks like it's kind of coming straight up right there. It looks like it's moving these fibers, and it's going to be going up into the cerebrum. These are actually called projection fibers. And projection fibers are going to be fibers that take sensory information up to the cerebral cortex, or they can actually bring it down. But in general, this is called a projection fiber, but it's a specific type. And that type is actually going to be called the corona radiata. But you can see a piece of this right here. So again, it's called internal capsule, and then it actually goes up into what's called the corona radiata. So that's the corona radiata. That's the corona radiata right there. And again, these parts over here are the lateral ventricles. White matter right there, and that's going to be consisting of myelinated axons. And right there, the pink stuff is the outer gray matter, which is unmyelinated cell bodies. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to put this back down, and we're going to take a look at the diencephalon and the brainstem. Okay, guys, so we've taken a look at the cerebrum, which was, again, derived from the telencephalon during embryonic development. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the diencephalon. Okay, so some of the deeper structures inside the cerebrum, where there's going to be a lot of gray matter and some also white matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the two temporal lobes off over there, put them over there. And then I'm going to pull this guy out by the brainstem, and we're going to get the cerebrum out of the way here. And then we're going to take a look specifically at the diencephalon, but we're only going to take a look at one of these first. Let's go ahead and take this one out. All right, guys, so what we're doing is we're just taking a look at half of the diencephalon with the half of the brainstem also. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn this in a little bit here. And if you notice right here, I have this structure right here. Remember I told you I was going to show you guys the insula? Well, there's the insula. The insula is really deep to the temporal lobe, and it's the fifth mini lobe, or also called the island of Real. So there's our insula right there. All right, so if you remember, guys, we're going to have this part right here. That was our corona radiata. All right, if you remember, he was at the top part. The corona radiata is those projection fibers that basically are going to come up and radiate all of those projection fibers, white matter, all the way up to the cerebral cortex. So again, that's going to be the corona radiata. Then let's go ahead and turn this in a little bit more, guys. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see a whole bunch of nonsense, right? So if we look here, remember I told you there was a lateral ventricle. Well, there's a part of the lateral ventricle. All of this right here is the lateral ventricle. It's this fluid-filled cavity right in here. So all this, imagine there's just a big fluid-filled cavity kind of right here. All this is like fluid, cerebrospinal fluid rushing across this. This is basically the lateral ventricle. And then this right here, that like nice blue and red like structure right there, that's called the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so there's our choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. And if underneath this, so imagine like the cerebrospinal fluid's kind of washing over, there's a nuclei here called the basal nuclei. And that one right there is called the caudate nucleus. So underneath this guy is the caudate nucleus. And the caudate nucleus is responsible for being able to dampen unwanted or motor movements, right? So again, caudate nucleus is right there. And it's being kind of washed by the lateral ventricle. And then again, you get the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. All right, then if you see right here, we have this little white fiber structure right there. This little white fiber is called the fornix. And the fornix is basically a fiber tract that connects a lot of different limbic nuclei together. And limbic nuclei are nuclei that are associated with emotions and fear and anger and maybe even sexual desires in certain situations like that. Okay, so he collects a lot of these limbic nuclei together. Underneath him is another choroid plexus. So that must mean that there's a ventricle in the vicinity, and they're always found in the roof. So in this area right here, there must be the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is located in this area right here. And again, it's just a potential space which consists of cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. So third ventricle is located in here, and there's the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Then back here, number 12, that's the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is responsible for being able to secrete melatonin. And melatonin is what regulates your sleep and wake cycles, or your diurnal cycles, by regulating activity of the suprachiasmatic nucleus within the hypothalamus. This right here, this little egg-shaped structure, this circular structure right there, is called the thalamus. You have two of them, so you have thalami. There's a kind of connection or interthalamic mass, that adhesions between the two thalami right there, that's called the intermediate mass. So you have the intermediate mass, which is right in the center of this thalamus. So imagine it being the eye. So again, you got a whole thing right here, which is the thalamus, and right in the center of it is the intermediate mass. Then down here, you have the hypothalamus. So imagine this being like the bird's beak. So 14 is the hypothalamus, imagine as the bird's beak, and imagine the thalamus and the intermediate mass being the eye of the bird, right? Okay, so then what else do we have here? We have also this structure right here, and this is going to be a part of what we call the infundibulum that gives way to the pituitary gland. It's what connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And then if I turn this guy around a little bit more, so we can look at the back part here. Now, guys, we're going off here and we're going into the brainstem now. So we're going into the first part of the brainstem, which is called the midbrain. So we have the midbrain right now. And the midbrain has what's called a superior colliculi right there. And right underneath it is the inferior colliculi. So you got superior colliculi, inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi control basically reflexive movements of the head in response to a visual stimulus. And the inferior colliculi control reflexive head movements in response to an auditory stimulus. Okay? And then if I turn it around again, so if we come back to the midbrain, we have this little tube right there that drains the third ventricle. This little tube right there is called the cerebral aqueduct. Okay? And the cerebral aqueduct actually gives way into this big, big ventricle down here. Oh, you see all this tent-shaped ventricle right there? This is all the fourth ventricle, all this right there, all fourth ventricle. Okay, so let's go back to the midbrain again. And again, so you got midbrain, then you got all of this being pons. All of this is pons. Then you have the medulla oblongata right there, okay? Then after that, you'll eventually go down to the spinal cord after this. So again, right here we have the pons, and then we got the medulla oblongata right there, guys. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn this guy around here so we can take a look at some other important structures here before we kind of finish up here. So if you look here, you can kind of see this really cool looking structure. It's like a white matter structure right there. That white matter right there is called the superior cerebellar peduncles. Now we also have middle cerebellar peduncles. I'll show you that in a second. And then down here we have our inferior cerebellar peduncles. And so how I remember that is the midbrain has to connect to the cerebellum. So these have to be the superior cerebellar peduncles. The pons has to connect to the cerebellum. So there's going to be one right here. I'll show you that on the cerebellum. There'll be the middle cerebellar peduncles. And the medulla has to connect to the cerebellum. So it has to be through the inferior cerebellar peduncles right there. Okay? And again, that's our fourth ventricle. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at another structure up here. So now let's take a look here. So if we come underneath, or actually inferior and posterior to the hypothalamus up there, there's going to be this little white nuclei right there. It looks like a little white nuclei. This is a limbic nuclei. So this is actually called the mammillary bodies. Okay, so that's called the mammillary bodies. So the mammillary bodies are going to be right there. And then while we're here, let's take a look at another structure here. I'm going to turn this over here on the side. And I want to get number 17. Number 17 is a very important structure. Now be careful with the way I say it. These are called the cerebral peduncles. Remember I said cerebellar before? These are cerebral peduncles. These are actually projection fibers. So these are what take sensory information up into the cerebrum. They have to go to the thalamus first because the thalamus is a relay station for a lot of the sensory information going into the brain. So again, these are called the cerebral peduncles, and they are projection fibers. Then after that, remember I told you I'd show you the middle cerebellar peduncles, where there they are. They're beautiful right there. Nice little beautiful cerebellar peduncles, but middle cerebellar peduncles right there. So if we had to see all of them, right there would be superior cerebellar peduncles, middle cerebellar peduncles, inferior cerebellar peduncles. So very beautifully we can see all of those. And again, there's the fourth ventricle right there. All right guys, so now we're taking an anterior view at the half section of the brain stem right here and part of the diencephalon. So again, this is midbrain, this is pons right there, this is medulla. And again, if you see this part right here, the medulla, this part right there that I'm kind of scraping across, that is the pyramids. So that's where the actual descending corticospinal tracts that actually take information to the muscles for motor movement, they actually cross, or what they call decussate at that point right there. So that's where the decussation occurs. So that's what actually forms this structure of the pyramids. It's the crossing over of the descending corticospinal tracts. Over here on the side, number 26, this little like pink-like structure right there, those are called the olives. Okay, so these are called the olives. All right, so we got the olives right there. All right, so again, we got the pyramids and then we got the olives. And the olives play a role in proprioception, which we'll talk about this when we get into neurophysiology. All right, guys, so now what we're going to do is, before we get into the cranial nerves, I want to show you one more structure. I'm going to take this guy off here so we can take a look there. So if you look here, this structure right here, kind of making this little C-like structure here, this is called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a commissural fiber, meaning that it allows for connection to be passed from left cerebral hemisphere to right cerebral hemisphere, or from right cerebral hemisphere to left cerebral hemisphere. So it's important for allowing for a left to right transmission. And it's actually one of the most common areas that is damaged during concussions. And it also can, there's certain surgical techniques that they can use to treat epilepsy also because of this guy. Okay, and then also right here, you have this membrane right here called the septum pellucidum. And the septum pellucidum is a membrane that basically, right underneath this, is actually going to be the lateral ventricle. So right behind this is the lateral ventricle. All right, guys, so now let's go ahead and dig right into the cranial nerves. All right, guys, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at all the cranial nerves. So let's go ahead and start right here. So right here we have cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 is specifically called the olfactory nerve. So what happens is you have these little nerves in your nasal cavity called the olfactory epithelium, and they pick up specific odorant chemicals. And they send those action potentials up through a specific part of the bony part of your skull, which is called the olfactory foramina within your cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And they run up through the glomeruli, and then they come up into this structure right here, which is called, again, the olfactory nerve. And so this is specifically a sensory nerve because it helps to be able to pick up what things? Well, specifically sensations for smell. Okay, so again, that's cranial nerve 1. Next one is cranial nerve 2, and it's these guys right there that I'm poking at right there, and this one right there. So if we were to be specific, this would be your left optic nerve, and this would be your right optic nerve, okay, because we're looking at it upside down. But we can call them cranial nerve 2. And again, what happens is when they're moving, one from the right eye, one from the left eye, they cross over. Some of the fibers cross right here. And so we could actually point at this point right there, wherever the two optic nerves are crossing over. That's called the optic chiasma. Okay, it's called the optic chiasma. All right, so we have the optic chiasma, which is where these two optic fibers are crossing, optic nerves. And then this guy is specifically going to be bringing that sensory information from the retina for vision, and it's moving through what's called the optic canal. And when it comes back through the optic canal, again, what kind of information would this be picking up? Sensory information. Okay, so that's cranial nerve 2. Then we got cranial nerve 3, which is right there. It's in the midbrain. It's within the interpeduncular fossa right there. So right there is cranial nerve 3. We also call him oculomotor nerve. This is the oculomotor nerve. So the oculomotor nerve is actually a motor nerve, and it kind of says it in its name. It actually moves through what's called the superior orbital fissure. And when it moves through that, it goes to a whole bunch of different extraocular eye muscles that we'll talk about in another anatomy video. And it controls eye movements, okay? After that, if we turn this guy a little bit over here, we have another nerve, which is called the trochlear nerve. So the trochlear nerve is another nerve that passes through specifically the superior orbital fissure. Okay, and the trochlear nerve is also playing a role within extraocular eye movements. Okay, so the trochlear nerve also plays a role within extraocular eye movements. Specifically, if you want to, he supplies what's called the superior oblique. Okay, so he's specifically controlling motor function. All right, so we talked about the trochlear nerve right there. Now we're going to come up here and talk about the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. So cranial nerve 5 is a really big nerve, and it helps to be able to supply a lot of the muscles of mastication. And it also helps to be able to pick up sensory information from the face too. So because of that, it's a very important nerve controlling both types of functions, both sensory and motor. Now where does it move? This sucker moves through the superior orbital fissure, the foramen rotundum, and the foramen ovale to be able to innervate those muscles of mastication and the specific areas of the skin for sensation. Okay, so that's our trigeminal nerve right there. And we're going to come over here. Now if you notice this guy popping off right there, that's called the abducens nerve. So that's cranial nerve 6. Cranial nerve 6, or the abducens nerve, runs through specifically the superior orbital fissure also, and innervates the lateral rectus. And the lateral rectus is basically an extraocular eye muscle that rotates the eye out laterally. Okay, so again, if we go right next to, a little bit more laterally over here from the abducens nerve, we come right there. This is the facial nerve. So facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. Now the facial nerve has many different branches. Okay, and it serves many different organs. We'll talk more in depth about all of the different organs and certain areas of the body it's innervates. But for right now, just know that it moves usually through what's called the stylomastoid foramen. So he can move through what's called the stylomastoid foramen, and he helps to be able to control both motor and sensory function. All right, so he controls both. Then if we come over here, you'll see two different branches of this nerve. That's because there's two different nerve fibers making up this whole nerve. There's actually a cochlear branch and a vestibular branch. So this whole nerve right here is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. And the vestibulocochlear nerve runs through what's called the internal auditory or acoustic meatus. And what he helps to do is he actually controls specifically dynamic and static equilibrium and hearing. But they do find that he does play a role also with motor movements too. So he controls both. Okay, so that's also going to be a neuron that controls both motor and sensory. Then if we come down over here, you see this little nib right there, that little nub. That little nub right there is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. And the glossopharyngeal nerve actually runs through what's called the jugular foramen. And it has many different organs that it can supply also. It can supply the tongue, it can supply the pharynx, it can supply specific baroreceptors. So he controls both sensory and motor function. So he's both, okay? Then above him, right here, we have specifically the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10. And he runs also through the jugular foramen, but he supplies so many different organs, it's not even funny. He's the main parasympathetic nerve. So most of the parasympathetic innervation that's carried, 90% of it is carried on your vagus nerve. So he controls a lot of different organs, and it's both sensory and motor. And like I said, we'll go over these in more detail in a neurophysiology lecture. Okay, and here we have, guys, we have the accessory nerve. So here's the accessory nerve right there. And the accessory nerve is pretty cool because there's a brainstem branch of him, and then there's the actual cervical branch of the spinal cord. And so what happens is he can move through the foramen magnum and merge with those fibers and help to be able to provide nerve fibers that supply the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. So he's mainly a motor nerve. Okay, so that's going to be your cranial nerve 11, which is again called the accessory nerve. And there's two branches of it. One is this brainstem branch, or the medullary branch, because it's coming off the medulla, and the other one's coming off the cervical region of the spinal cord, and they come together and fuse. All right, then over here we have our last nerve right there, and this nerve is called the hypoglossal nerve, or cranial nerve 12. And it runs through the hypoglossal canal and supplies specific areas of the tongue, specifically the muscles of the tongue, the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, which helps to be able to protrude the tongue or move the tongue around from left to right, protract, retract, okay? So he's mainly a motor nerve. All right, guys, so we've basically talked about all of the cranial nerves and what holes they move through. We haven't discussed all of their functions, but we will in detail in neurophysiology. So if we look here at the cerebellum, guys, he's really important. He has unconscious control of our skeletal muscles through proprioception. It controls the tone of muscles, and it controls equilibrium, and a lot of different other things. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at him. So if we look here, you can see this little structure, this little worm-like structure between the two parts of the cerebellum. That is actually called the vermis. And what's important to mention about the vermis is that in between the vermis, there's a dural septa that dips in between those two. That is called the falx cerebelli. And again, what the function of the dural septa is to protect a lot of the dural sinuses, which are the veins in that area. Okay? And then you're going to have the outer gray matter of the cerebellum, which is called the cerebellar cortex. And again, gray matter is just unmyelinated cell bodies. And then you're going to have these little folds here, which are called the folia. All right? Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bring this down a little bit more so we can take a look at another structure here. So if I take, again, this was the occipital lobes right here, right? And then if I look at that little structure, right, that little slit-like structure between the cerebellum and the occipital lobe, this is called the transverse fissure. And the transverse fissure is where we have another dural septa that dips in between there called the tentorium cerebelli. And the tentorium cerebelli, the function of that is to, again, protect the dural sinuses that act like veins. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the cerebellum inward so we can take a look at a couple other structures here. All right, guys, so I have just one half of the cerebellum here, and what I'm going to do here is you can see here we got this white matter here that looks like a tree. They call this the arbor vitae, which just means tree of life. So it's this little white matter right there. And again, a white matter is just myelinated axons. And then again, around the edges here, we're going to have unmyelinated cell bodies, which you could have some certain types of cells there called Purkinje cells are very common ones. And again, it's unmyelinated cell bodies. That's what gray matter is. Okay? And then if I turn it a little bit here, you can see 42, that's a white matter structure. Remember I told you that there was a big structure that connects the pons to the cerebellum? Well, that's this guy. That's called the middle cerebellar peduncles. And again, that's white matter. All right? So that covers the cerebellum. All right, guys, one more thing before we finish this video. So if we look here, we have only present on the left side of the cerebrum on the frontal lobe, there's this kind of little area here that controls the muscles of speech. They call that the Broca's area, okay? So again, the Broca's area controls muscles of speech. All right, so that's the Broca's area, only on the left side of the frontal lobe. Then over here in the temporal lobe is called the primary auditory cortex. So it has neurons there that basically help to be able to pick up sensations from the cochlea that controls sound and hearing, and basically interpret that into words, right? So that again, he's important for primary auditory cortex, for picking up auditory information. And then we also have another area, which is kind of a little bit of the temporal lobe, and it's overlapping over here into the parietal. It's kind of like they kind of encircle it with a little dashed line around all of this area right here. This is called the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area is really important for being able to understand or put together the words that someone's telling you, and to be able to put that into a full sentence, basically. So whenever there's aphasia of this area, sometimes they have a hard time being able to put together words, and whenever you're trying to speak them, it kind of gets jumbled up together. Okay, so it's really important for that. And then Broca's areas that would have a hard time being able to speak. So they might have Broca's aphasia, so trouble being able to speak. And then if I turn this around all the way to the back, remember we had the occipital lobe right there. Well, the occipital lobe is where the primary visual cortex is. So if you remember all those fibers that are coming from the optic nerve, they'll go to the thalamus through what's called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then get sent over to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, where we'll be able to perceive the visual stimulus that we take in from the retina. So what did we cover pretty much? We covered the cerebrum in detail, we covered the diencephalon, we covered the brainstem and the cerebellum and some of the associated cortexes. I hope you guys enjoyed it. See you, Ninja Nerds. All right, Ninja Nerds, so we've already covered the brain in another video. Our intention in this video is to just be able to give you guys another view of the brain and some of the internal structures. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. So first off, if you remember from before, we had this central sulcus here on the side. And it's just this little, this little groove right here running right there. This guy right there is actually called the central sulcus. So again, the central sulcus is this little like groove right here running all the way up right there. And what's the purpose of it? The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So if I come up the central sulcus one more time, if I go right in front of this sulcus to this gyrus right there, because remember, a sulcus is like this little like divot, and then a gyrus is this big fat lumpy thing right there, right? This gyrus in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. It's also where the primary motor cortex is. And if I follow this central sulcus back up again, and I go to this fat gyrus that's right behind it, that guy right there is called the postcentral gyrus. And that's where the primary somatosensory cortex is. All right. And then if I were to go in front of the primary motor here, which is where the precentral gyrus is, I'd hit like the premotor, and then you come in front of that and you hit what's called the prefrontal cortex, and so on and so forth. There's even called the eyelids, stuff like that. But again, basic important thing right here is central sulcus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is functionally called the primary motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus is functionally called the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay? Then if I were to continue to work my way back to see where else does the parietal lobe, where does that terminate and where does it go into another lobe? So if I come over here, I'm going to take this brain and kind of like open it up here, turn it around. So if we look here, you'll see another sulcus right there. That sulcus right there is actually called the parieto-occipital sulcus. And the parieto-occipital sulcus is what separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So back here is the occipital lobe. I'll give you guys another view here in a second. Just let me repeat that one more time again. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. And the parieto-occipital sulcus is what separates the parietal lobe, which begins right after the central sulcus, all the way up to this sulcus, and it separates the parietal lobe again from the occipital lobe. All right, guys, so if we look back here, we have the occipital lobe back there. Again, and what separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is the occipital lobe. In the occipital lobe, there's a specific cortex. It's actually called the primary visual cortex. And so that's where, the actual signal transduction that comes from our retina that portrays, basically light, we can actually have the perception of that light in this area to be able to perceive what we see, certain types of objects and shapes and colors and so on and so forth. So again, primary visual cortex is located within the occipital lobe. And then if I turn this to the right side or lateral side over here, we can see another sulcus. And this sulcus is right here. It's actually, let me move this rubber band, guys, so we can see a little better. So if I move that rubber band right there and I move my finger this little pointer here, right through this area, right through that sulcus right there is called the lateral sulcus. Now the lateral sulcus is the sulcus that separates the temporal lobe, again, from the parietal lobe and even a little bit from the frontal lobe. But this lateral sulcus runs right down here, and it separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe and even a little bit from the frontal lobe. So again, what is this lobe right here then? Like I already said, this is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe has a specific cortex in it, which is called the primary auditory cortex. And the primary auditory cortex is going to be where we take specifically sound and hearing from the cochlea in our inner ear, and we bring it to this area to be able to perceive and put together different types of memories to understand what we're hearing and be able to perceive that hearing, right? All right, so that's where the primary auditory cortex is. Okay, and that's the temporal lobe. There is another lobe. We can't see him. He's going to be deep to the temporal lobe, and that's called the insula. All right, so let's go ahead and show you two more other areas that are kind of important here. And what I'm going to do is it's only on the left side of the frontal lobe. It's called the Broca's area. So the Broca's area is just going to be this little area over here on the left side of the frontal lobe. Okay, and it controls the muscles of speech production. So being able to change the shape of our mouth and other types of muscles that are basically assisting within pronunciation and production of consonants and so on and so forth. But again, just controls the muscles of speech production. There's another area back here. It's kind of an overlapping area right around here that's called the Wernicke's area. And basically, he just helps us to be able to understand what we're hearing and put those words together in a appropriate manner that when we speak it makes sense. Okay, so he does help with being able to play a role also in speech production, but also understanding speech. All right, so that's the Wernicke's area. Now what I'm going to do is we're actually going to kind of take this guy here and turn it forward here so I can show you another structure. This whole thing up here is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum It's actually derived from what's called the telencephalon. Okay, that's its scientific name. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of separate these two cerebral hemispheres right there. And what happens is there's a fissure that runs right between these two. And that's called the longitudinal fissure. It's called the longitudinal fissure. Why I mention that is there's what's called dural sinuses that are veins that run through this area, and we have to protect them. So there's these things called dural septa, which are just little septal partitions of dura mater that dip down into this longitudinal fissure and protect the dural sinuses. And that dural septa that comes in here in the longitudinal fissure is called the falx, F-A-L-X, cerebri. So falx cerebri. And again, it's right here in the longitudinal fissure. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and turn this guy around so we can tell you guys about another one. So I'm going to come back here, back where the occipital lobe was. And if you remember, this was the occipital lobe, right? Well, how do we know? We know where the parietal lobe ends. You remember it starts at the central sulcus and then it ends at the parietal occipital sulcus. And that's where the occipital lobe begins, at the parietal occipital sulcus. Where does it end? It ends right back here, where there's this little space in here, right between the occipital lobe and this cerebellum right there. So in between here is what's called the transverse fissure. And the transverse fissure is important because there's another dural septa that actually dips in that area. And that right there is called the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, tentorium cerebelli. And it's just a dural matter partition or septa that dips in that area. Okay? Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead deeper into the structures of the cerebrum and take a look at that. Okay? All right, guys, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some other structures underneath the cerebrum. So deep in the cerebrum, I just want to show you guys, if you see all this white right here, this is all white matter. And what white matter is it's just myelinated axons. So it's myelinated axons, and myelinated axons just means it has this thing called myelin, which is made up of fat and proteins. Helps with basically nerve conduction, the speed of nerve conduction. But anyway, myelinated axons right here is going to be the white matter. All this pink stuff around the edges are the outsides of it. This is all part of what's called our cerebral cortex, and that's made of gray matter. And gray matter is actually unmyelinated cell bodies. So there's no myelin around the cell bodies. Okay, so unmyelinated cell bodies is our gray matter, which makes up the cerebral cortex. And you can think of that like as the thinking tissue. So that's the part where they're the biomechanical centers, and they're the ones that control a lot of the thinking or conscious thought. This white matter, you can think about it as like transmission tissue. It's basically responsible for being able to transmit impulses to and from certain areas. Okay, so that shows you the cerebral cortex, and again shows the white matter right there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some other structures, which is in the diencephalon and the ventricles. All right, guys, so I have the left cerebral hemisphere right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this top piece off so we can take a deeper look at some structures inside here. All right, so if we take a look in here, right now we're kind of in the lateral ventricle. And ventricles are just basically cavities within the actual brain and also within the brain stem. And it contains what's called cerebral spinal fluid. And we'll talk about that in more of the neurophysiology stuff. But if you look right here, sitting in the bottom of the lateral ventricle down here, this is actually, if you remember from the other video, it's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a limbic nuclei, so it plays a role with memory and emotions and so on and so forth. So it does play a very, very important role within basically memory. If you look here, that's 190. And if I come up here and I follow these white fibers, like 186, if I follow it all the way from here, all the way back, and then I come back up this way, so again, all the way up here, following this guy, and all the way back this way, these fibers are very important. They're called association fibers. And association fibers are what allow for the movement of impulses to go from in front of the cerebrum to the back of the cerebrum, or vice versa. Okay, so again, these are association fibers, and this is the hippocampus, and then this whole cavity right here. So like, for example, this is the inferior horn, this is the posterior horn, and then we'll see the anterior horn in a second. That's all the lateral ventricle. Okay, and again, you can see the white matter, and then you can see the gray matter out there. So the last structure here is going to be number 206, and this is actually called the internal capsule. And the internal capsule is actually a specific fiber. It's called a projection fiber. And projection fibers are important for being able to bring sensory information up to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so they bring information up, all right? But they can't allow for information to go down also. So they just basically allow for movement to go up and down. So association is back and forth, so back and front, and projection is up and down, up and down. And we'll look at another one in a second called the commissural fibers. All right, now we're going to go ahead and turn it around and look at some other structures, guys. All right, so I just turned it around, guys. So again, we're looking here at kind of like the other view. I was on the back side, now we're looking over here on the front side. So if you look right here, there's a nuclei right here. It's a basal nuclei. And basal nuclei just are important for being able to dampen or smooth out certain motor movements. He's one of them. He's called the caudate nucleus. So that's the caudate nucleus right there. But this whole, remember I told you there was another anterior horn of that lateral ventricle. So there's a little cavity here. And this whole cavity right here is the lateral ventricle. And if you look right here, this structure right there is actually called it's a choroid plexus, because there is a choroid plexus, which is basically made up of ependymal cells and pia mater, and you're also going to have your capillaries in there, and it's what helps to be able to make the cerebrospinal fluid and circulate it. So again, this is going to be the lateral ventricle, this cavity here. Imagine it like bathing this nucleus here. Imagine it bathing this caudate nucleus, and imagine this whole cavity filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and that's made by this thing called the choroid plexus. And then you can see this fiber right there. There's another white matter fiber, and this is actually called the fornix. And the fornix is a white fiber that actually, it's a tract, which is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, that connects multiple limbic nuclei together. So again, this structure right here, all the way from here, all the way from here, this is called the fornix. And the fornix is basically what helps to be able to connect multiple limbic nuclei together. So again, last time, lateral ventricle, caudate nucleus, choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle, and the fornix. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and look at some of these other structures in the diencephalon. All right, guys, so this right here is the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum number 145 here. This is actually going to be made up of what's called commissural fibers. And commissural fibers are just, again, myelinated axons that allow for transmission of impulses from left cerebral hemisphere to right, or from right cerebral hemisphere to left cerebral hemisphere. So it's very important for that connection. It's also an area that's commonly damaged during concussions. And it's actually been found that women have more commissural fibers than men do, which allows for them to be able to have a little bit better, be better at multitasking and stuff like that. And it also plays a role in epilepsy and stuff like that, but we're not going to get into that. Okay, so again, corpus callosum there. If you look here, there's a membrane, 146. So this thin membrane here is called the septum pellucidum. And underneath the septum pellucidum is that lateral ventricle that I was showing you guys before. So underneath this septum pellucidum is the lateral ventricle, okay? So it's just a thin membrane that separates the two lateral ventricles. Because again, we have a lateral ventricle in this one cerebral hemisphere, let's say the right one, and we'll also have a lateral ventricle in the left cerebral hemisphere. And the structure separating them, this membrane, is the septum pellucidum. If you guys look at the ventricle model we have, you'll also see a better way of looking at that also. All right, let's come back here again. 148 here, this is the fornix. And again, that was that fiber tract that connects a lot of the limbic nuclei together. If I imagine I draw a whole circle, let's say I do a whole circle all the way around here, or you imagine like an egg. An egg is kind of like oval shaped, right? So this whole thing right here is the thalamus. So this whole egg structure here with a whole bunch of nuclei is the thalamus. And the thalamus is actually the relay station for a lot of sensory information going up into the cerebrum, because he has tons of nuclei that regulate that activity. Then if you look there, that little brown structure right there, that's called the intermediate mass. And it basically is like an interthalamic adhesion between the two thalami, because you'd have a thalamus in your right cerebral hemisphere and you'd have a thalamus in your left cerebral hemisphere. So you have two of them. If you actually imagine here, imagine this being an eye, like a bird's eye. Okay, so if you can imagine that, you can imagine the bird's eye, which is kind of like the white of the eye is like the thalamus, and then the pupil right there is where the intermediate mass is. And if you imagine the bird's beak right there, this right there, that bird's beak is actually the hypothalamus. So they can kind of say, look at like a bird's eye and a bird's beak. And again, the bird's eye is made up of the thalamus and the intermediate mass, and the bird's beak is the hypothalamus. If you look back here, you have what's called the pineal gland, which is a part of the epithalamus. Then you're also going to notice this little, like the hypothalamus has this little stalk here on this side that connects to the pituitary gland that would sit right underneath the optic chiasma. Actually, this is, if you look at 170 there, that's one where the optic nerves cross. There's actually called the optic chiasma. So for example, this is the right cerebrum, so this would be the right optic nerve here, and it's getting ready to, some of its fibers will cross over to the left side. Okay, so that's kind of like the optic chiasma there. And then this part right there is the infundibulum. Then if you look right there, that little ball there, that right there is called the mammillary bodies. And the mammillary bodies are also important because they play a role within certain types of olfactory pathways. So they play a role in smell. That's the mammillary bodies, and they're limbic nuclei. So they play a role in recollective memory, stuff like that. Okay, if you come over here, we're going to see some other structures because now we're getting ready to start moving into the brainstem. So as we get ready to move over here, let's actually hit our brainstem. So if you look right here, all this part right here, this is all called the midbrain, and they also call it the mesencephalon. So it's derived from the mesencephalon. All this right here is our pons. This is all our pons. And the pons, and this right here is the cerebellum, they were actually derived from what's called the metencephalon. And then if we look here, all the way over here, this is the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata was derived from what's called the myelencephalon. So again, I'll hit it one more time. Mesencephalon, and then you got your metencephalon, which is made up of the pons and the cerebellum. And then you have your myelencephalon, which is the medulla oblongata, right? Okay. Another thing here is, I also mentioned it a little bit before. I had mentioned that all this area right here is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is mainly made up of three things, which we said: thalamus, hypothalamus, and then technically the epithalamus, which consists of the pineal gland. There's this little cavity right here that also contains cerebrospinal fluid, and this is called the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle will be a cavity right in this vicinity right here. So it actually gets drained from the lateral ventricle. So here's our third ventricle. The third ventricle actually drains some of that actual fluid from the lateral ventricle. Then there's another little tube right here, running right here through the midbrain. So if you see a little tube right there, that's actually called the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct drains the third ventricle, and the third ventricle drains the lateral ventricle via what's called the interventricular foramen. So again, third ventricle here, and then cerebral aqueduct here. Then the cerebral aqueduct moves into what's called the fourth ventricle. And then from the fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid can go two ways. It can go down through the central canal, it eventually go through the central canal of the spinal cord, or it can go out through these two little holes called the foramen luschka and the foramen magendi. Or you can say foramen magendi is the median apertures, and the foramen luschka is the lateral apertures. Okay, so that's that part there. Okay, now if we look here in the back of the midbrain, we see these two little like balls there, right? This top one right there is called the superior colliculi. And basically what he helps you to do is being able to move, it's like a reflexive movement of your head in response to some type of visual stimulus. So for example, if I see Kate Upton walking by, my head is going to move with response to that visual stimulus. And then down here is the inferior colliculi. The inferior colliculi actually controls reflexive head movements in response to auditory stimulus. So for example, if Kate Upton's boyfriend yelled at me, "Hey, what you doing looking at her?" my head would move that way too. So that's an example of that right there. Okay, so superior colliculi, inferior colliculi there. All right, so if I look here, guys, there's another structure I want to show you. It's 182 right there. That structure right there is called the cerebral peduncles. So it's like this stalk. And again, these are projection fibers actually. So if you remember the cerebral peduncles, these are projection fibers. They're right around the midbrain, and they carry sensory information up into the cerebrum. Okay, so again, that's the cerebral peduncles right there. All right, guys, so if we look here, I have 183 right there. This is the pyramids. This is the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, and that's where the descending motor fibers actually decussate or cross right there. Okay, so the pyramids is due to the decussation or just crossing of the descending motor pathways. All right, guys, so if we look over here on the side of the medulla oblongata, like on this side of it, all this pink gummy stuff, that's all the olives. And the olives are actually broken up into two nuclei. You get your superior olivary nuclei and inferior olivary nuclei. And the superior, basically, they play a role in basically the auditory pathways. And the inferior olivary nuclei play a role within proprioception and cerebellar motor function and learning and stuff like that. Okay, so again, olives play a role in proprioception, and they play a role in basically in hearing also. All right, so that's your olives. Now what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to basically go over the cerebellum now. All right, guys, so if you look here, you can see all of this like tree-like structure right there, all this white like tree-like looking thing. All this white matter here is called the arbor vitae. And the arbor vitae is just basically the white matter of the cerebellum. Arbor vitae actually stands for like tree of life. So again, all this white matter here is the arbor vitae. And the outer gray matter on the actual edges, where you'll find like your Purkinje cells and certain stuff like that, like all the outer side is the gray matter of the cerebellar cortex. And again, that's just unmyelinated cell bodies. Okay, and if you look here in the back of the cerebellum here, if you see all these little divots there, it's actually called folia. So the folia are basically like the folds of the cerebellum. Okay, so all these like little lines right there that you see forming these little folds, that's called the folia. All right, guys, so if you look right here, right in between the actual cerebellum, there's actually this little worm-like structure between them. It's actually called the vermis. And in between the vermis, there's like an actual dural septa, like I said before, that actually runs in between there. And that dural septa is actually called the falx cerebelli. The falx cerebelli. Okay, again, so this structure right there between the two cerebellum is the actual vermis, and the dural septa that goes between the two is actually called the falx cerebelli. All right, so that pretty much covers the cerebellum. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the cranial nerves. So if we look right here, we're going to see cranial nerve 1. That's the olfactory nerve. And again, remember that the olfactory nerve originates in the nasal cavity through the olfactory epithelium, and that actually picks up certain types of sensations like smell from odorants and different types of chemicals, and carries that up through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then up into specifically up into this olfactory bulb here, where there's glomeruli and mitral cells. Okay, so he's the sensory nerve. Then right here, you're going to notice two optic nerves right there. So there's your left optic nerve, there's your right optic nerve, and then the point at which they cross is called the optic chiasma. Okay, and so the optic nerve is, basically picks up sensations of vision. So he picks up the vision stimulus and then takes that into the actual cerebrum, right, specifically to that primary visual cortex. Then, we're going to have to go in and separate this guy so we can look at some other structures here, so we can look at the midbrain a little bit deeper. All right, guys, so if we look here, we can see cranial nerve 3. It actually comes out in between the interpeduncular fossa right there at the midbrain. That's called the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3. The oculomotor nerve actually runs through the superior orbital fissure and supplies a lot of the extraocular eye muscles. I also didn't mention the hole that the optic nerve runs through, but you could imagine it's the optic canal. So again, oculomotor nerve runs through the superior orbital fissure and supplies a lot of extraocular eye muscles. Then if we come down here, we can see this little, you see this little white thing right there, guys? That little white piece of thing popping down there. That's called the trochlear nerve. So that's called trochlear nerve, or cranial nerve 4. And the cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve, actually runs also through the superior orbital fissure and supplies the what's called the superior oblique muscle, which is another extraocular eye muscle. Okay, so he plays a role in motor functioning. All right, so here's the trochlear nerve again, right? So that's cranial nerve 4. And then if you look down here, we have these two nerves, because they're paired, guys. So we're going to see the trigeminal nerve here, which is cranial nerve 5, and you'll see the trigeminal nerve here, which is, again, cranial nerve 5. So the trigeminal nerve is a really big one, and it actually splits into 3 branches. And it actually runs through 3 holes. It can run through the superior orbital fissure, it can run through the foramen ovale and the foramen rotundum. And the trigeminal nerve supplies the muscles of mastication, and he also supplies certain areas of the skin of the face to pick up sensation. So he plays a role in muscle action, which is mastication, chewing, and he also picks up sensations on the face. Interestingly, this is actually, if this has what's called neuralgia, trigeminal neuralgia, where there's some certain type of nerve pain, this can cause one of the most severe nerve pains actually known to man. It's actually called trigeminal neuralgia, and it's extremely, extremely painful. They actually call it the suicide disease. All right, then if we come down here to this structure right there and that structure right there, these are actually your cranial nerve 6, or the abducens nerve, and he also runs through the superior orbital fissure, and he supplies the lateral rectus. And again, that's another extraocular eye muscle. Then if we move out laterally over here, we're going to have these 2 guys. Let's see this one right there and this one over here. That's actually called the facial nerve. So that's cranial nerve 7. So this one right there and this one right there. Okay, and the facial nerve has 5 branches. But he can run through the stylomastoid foramen, and he also can run through the internal acoustic meatus. But basically, he supplies the muscles of facial expression, a lot of glands within the, like the lacrimal gland and nasal glands and stuff like that. So he plays a role in both. He actually plays, and he also picks up sensations, again, from the face as well. So he's actually a motor nerve and a sensory nerve. Okay, so that's the facial nerve. Then if we go over here to the edge, that one right there over there, and this one right there on that edge, that is actually called the vestibulocochlear nerve. And the vestibulocochlear nerve, he also runs through the internal acoustic meatus, and he basically carries dynamic and static equilibrium and just general sound and hearing. And that's that guy. Then if we come down here, there's this little chunk right there, which is the same chunk right there. That's called the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. And he actually runs through the jugular foramen, and he supplies the tongue. He supplies certain muscles of the pharynx. He also can act as he can pick up sensations from the baroreceptors. So he plays a lot of roles in different sensory and motor functions as well. Okay, below him is the vagus nerve. So this one right there, and this one right there. That's cranial nerve 10. So again, vagus nerve right there and right there. He is the main parasympathetic nerve. Okay, he carries about 90% of the parasympathetic flow. And he also runs through the jugular foramen. He supplies many, many different organs, from the heart to the lungs to the GI tract to the urogenital tract, so on and so forth. So again, that's your vagus nerve. So if you look down here, guys, you'll see this nerve right here and over here. It's cranial nerve 11, which is called the accessory nerve. Now, the accessory nerve has two parts, one that actually is on the cervical part of the spinal cord and one on this medulla here, like the medullary branch. And what happens is the cervical branch of the accessory nerve comes up through the foramen magnum and merges with this branch off the medulla. And as a collection, they run through the jugular foramen, and they go and supply the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid, which are again, those somatic muscles or skeletal muscle. All right, so that's the accessory nerve. So he's mainly a motor nerve. And then the last one right here is this guy right there, which is the same as this guy right there. And that's cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. And the hypoglossal nerve actually runs through what's called the hypoglossal canal and supplies some of the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, okay? So he's mainly a motor nerve. All right, guys, so that pretty much covers all the cranial nerves. I hope this video helped, guys, and see you, Ninja Nerds.